Darkly Dreaming Dexter, Chapter 14. I was almost certain he was the one, but only almost, and I had never been almost certain before. I felt weak, intoxicated, half sick with a combination of excitement and uncertainty and complete wrongness, but of course the dark passenger was driving from the back seat now, and how I felt was not terribly important anymore because he felt strong and cold and eager and ready. And I could feel him swelling inside of me, surging up through the Dexter dark corners of my lizard brain, a rising and swelling that could only end one way. That being the case, it rather had to be with this one. I had found him several months ago, but after a little bit of observation, I decided it was a priest who was sure a thing, and this one would wait a little longer until I was positive. How wrong I had been. I now found he couldn't wait at all. He lived on a small street in Coconut Grove, a few blocks to one side of his crummy little house in the neighborhood, which was low-income black housing, barbecue joints, and crumbling churches. Half a mile in the other direction, the millionaires lived in overgrown modern houses. Half a mile in the other direction, the millionaires lived there. And overgrown modern houses and built coral walls to keep people out, like him, Jamie Jaworski. But Jamie Jaworski was right in between, in a house he shared with him. Oh my god, fuck me. Shared with a million pimento bugs and the ugliest dog I had ever seen. It was still a house he shouldn't have been able to afford. Jaworski was a part-time janitor at Ponce de Leon Junior High, and as far as I could tell, that was his way and his only source of income. He worked 3 days a week, which might just be enough to live on, but not much more. Of course, I was not interested in his finances. I was very interested in the fact that there had been a small but significant increase in runaway children from Ponce since Jaworski had begun to work there. All of them 12 to 13-year-old girls, light-haired girls. Light-haired. That was important. For some reason, it was the kind of detail that police often seemed to overlook, but always jumped out at someone like me. Perhaps it didn't seem politically correct. Dark-haired girls and dark-skinned girls should have an equal opportunity to be kidnapped, sexually abused, and then cut up in front of a camera. Don't you think? Jaworski, too, often seemed to be missing the kid's last witness. The police had talked to him, held him overnight, questioned him, and had not been able to make anything stick to him. Of course, they have to meet certain petty legal requirements. Torture, for example, was frowned on lately for the most part. Without some very forceful persuasion, Jamie Jaworski was never going to open up about his hobby. I know, I wouldn't. But I knew he was doing it. He was helping those girls disappear into very quick and final movie careers. He was almost positive. I was positive. I had not found any body parts and hadn't seen him do it, but everything fit. And on the internet, I did manage to locate some particularly inventive pictures of the 3 missing girls. They did locate some not very looking happy in those pictures, although some of the things they were doing were supposed to bring joy, I have been told. I could not positively connect Jaworski with the pictures, but the mailbox address was South Miami, a few minutes from the school, and he was living above his means. And in any case, I was being reminded with increasing force from the dark back seat that I was out of time and that there was not a case where certainty was terribly important. But the ugly dog worried. Dogs were always a problem. They don't like me, and quite often they disapprove of what I do to their masters, especially since I don't share the good pieces. I had to finally find a way around the dog to Jaworski. Perhaps he would come out. If not, I had to find a way in. I drove past Jaworski's house 3 times, but nothing occurred to me. I needed some luck, and I needed it before the dark passenger made me do something hasty. And just as my dear friend began to whisper imprudent suggestions, I got my small piece of luck. Jaworski came out of his house and climbed into his battered red Toyota pickup as I drove past. I slowed down as much as I could, and in a moment he backed out and yanked his little truck towards Douglas Road. I turned around and followed. I had no idea I was going to do this. I was not prepared. I had no safe room, no clean coveralls, nothing but a roll of duct tape and a fillet knife under my seat. I had to be unseen, unnoticed, and perfect. And I had no idea how. I hated to improvise. But I was not being offered the choice. Once again, I was lucky. Traffic was very light as Jaworski drove south to Old Cutler Road, and after a mile or so, he turned left towards the water. Another huge development was going up to improve life for all of us by turning trees and animals into cement and old people from New Jersey. Jaworski drove slowly through the construction, past half a golf course with the flags in place but no grass on it, until he came almost to the water. The skeleton of a large, half-finished block of condos blotted out the moon. I dropped far back and turned out my headlights and then inched close enough to see what my boy was up to. Jaworski had pulled beside the block of condos to be and parked. He got out and stood between his little truck and a huge pile of sand. For a moment, he just looked around, and I pulled onto the shoulder and turned off the engine. Jaworski stared at the condos and then down the road towards the water. He seemed satisfied and went into the building. I was quite certain that he was looking for a guard. I was, too. I hoped he had done his homework. Most often in these huge Uber developments, one guard rides around from site to site on a golf cart. It saves money, and anyway, this is Miami. A certain amount of the overhead of any project or for any material is expected to disappear quietly. It looked to me like Jaworski planned to help the builder meet his quota. I got out of my car and slipped my fillet knife and duct tape into a cheap tote bag I brought along with me. I had already stuffed some rubberized gardening gloves and a few pictures inside. Nothing much, just trifles I downloaded from the internet. I shrugged the bag onto my shoulder and moved quietly through the night until I came to this grungy little truck. The bed was as empty as the cab. Heaps of Burger King cups and wrappers and empty Camel packs on the floor. Nothing that wasn't small and dirty like Jaworski himself. I looked up. Above the rim of the half condo, I could just see the glow of the moon. A night wind blew across my face, bringing with it all of the enchanting odors of our tropical paradise. Diesel oil, decaying vegetation, and cement. I inhaled it deeply and turned my thoughts back towards Jaworski. He was somewhere inside of the shell of the building. I didn't know how long I had, and a certain small voice was urging me to hurry. I left the truck and went into the building. As I stepped through the door, I heard him. Or rather, I heard a strange whirring, rattling sound that had to be him, or... I paused. The sound came from off to one side, and I whisper-footed over to it. A pipe ran up the wall, an electrical conduit. I placed a hand over the pipe, and it felt like it was vibrating, as if something wrong was inside and was moving. A small light went on in my brain. Jaworski was pulling out the wire. Copper was very expensive, and there was a thriving black market for copper in any form. It was one more small way to supplement a meager janitorial salary, helping to cover the long poverty-strewn stretches between young runaways. He could make several $100s just for one load of copper. Now that I knew what he was up to, a vague outline of an idea began to take root in my brain. From the sound above me, I could easily track him, shadow him, until the time was right, and then pounce. But I was practically naked here, completely exposed and unready. I was used to doing these things a certain way. To step outside my own careful boundaries made me extremely uncomfortable. A small shudder crawled up my spine. Why was I doing this? The quick answer, of course, was that I wasn't doing it at all. My dear friend in the dark back seat was doing it. I was just along because I had the driver's license. But we had reached an understanding, he and we had achieved a careful, balanced existence. A way to live together through our Harry's solution. And he was rampaging outside Harry's carefully beautiful chalk lines. Why? Anger? Was the invasion of my home such an outrage that it awoke him out to strike in revenge? He didn't feel angry to me. He seemed cool, quietly amused, eager for his prey. And I didn't feel angry either. I felt half drunk, high as a kite, teetering on the edge of euphoria, wobbling through a series of inner ripples that felt curiously like I have always thought emotions must feel. And the giddiness of it had driven me to this dangerous, unclean, unplanned place to do something on the spur of the moment that always before I had planned carefully. And even knowing all of this, I badly wanted to do it. I had to do it. Very well then. But I didn't have to do it undressed. I looked around. A large pile of sheetrock squatted at the far end of the room, but bound with shrink wrap. A moment's work, and I had cut myself an apron and a strange transparent mask from the shrink wrap. Nose, mouth, and eyes sliced away so I could breathe, talk, and see. I pulled it tight, feeling it mash my features into something unrecognizable. I twisted the ends behind my head and tied a clumsy knot in plastic. Perfect anonymity. It might seem silly, but I was used to hunting with a mask. And aside from a neurotic compulsion to make everything right, it was simply one less thing to think about. It made me relax a little, so it was good. A very good idea. I took the gloves from the tote bag and slipped them on. I was ready now. I found Jaworski on the 3rd floor, a pile of electrical wire pulled at his feet. I stood in the shadow of the stairwell and watched as he pulled out the wire. I ducked back into the stairwell and opened my tote bag. Using my duct tape, I hung up the pictures I had brought along. Sweet little photos of the runaway girls in a variety of endearing and very explicit poses. I taped them to the concrete of the walls where Jaworski would see them as he stepped through the door onto the stairs. I looked back in at Jaworski. He pulled out another 20 yards of wire. It was stuck on something and would pull no more. Jaworski yanked twice, then he pulled a pair of heavy cutters from his back pocket and snipped the wire. He picked up the wire laying at his feet and wound it into a tight coil on his forearm, and then he walked towards the stairs. Towards me. I shrank back into the stairwell and waited. Jaworski wasn't trying to be quiet. He was not expecting any interruption, and he certainly wasn't expecting me. I listened to his footsteps and the small rattle of the wire coil dragging behind him. Closer. Jaworski wasn't trying to be quiet. He came through the door and a step passed without seeing me, and then he saw the pictures. "Oof," he said, as though he had been hit hard in the stomach. He stared, slack-jawed, unable to move, and then I was behind him with my knife at his throat. "Don't move and don't make a sound," we said. "Hey, look it," he said. I turned my wrist and slightly pushed the knife toward his skin under the chin. He hissed with a distressing, awful little spurt of blood while it squirted out. So unnecessary. Why can't people ever listen? I said, "Don't make a sound," we told him, and now he was quiet. Breathing and the quiet chuckle from the dark passenger. I taped over his mouth, twisted a length of janitor's precious copper wire around his wrists, and dragged him over to another stack of shrink-wrapped sheetrock. In just a few moments, I trussed him up and secured to the makeshift table. "Let's talk," we said in the dark passenger's gentle, cold voice. Let's talk. He didn't know if he was allowed to speak, and the duct tape would have made it difficult in any case, so he stayed silent. "Let's talk about the runaways," we said, ripping the duct tape from his mouth. "Yow! What do you mean?" he said, but he was not very convincing. "I think you know what I mean," we told him. No, he said. Yes, we said. Probably one word too clever. My timing was off. The whole evening was off, but he got brave. He looked up at me in my shiny face. "What are you, a cop or something?" he asked. "No," we said, and sliced off his left ear as it was closest. The knife was sharp, and for a moment he couldn't believe it was happening to him. Permanent and forever, no left ear. So I dropped the ear on his chest to let him believe. His eyes got huge and filled his lungs to scream, but I stuffed a wad of plastic wrap in his mouth just before he did. "None of that," we said. "Worse things can happen." And they would. Oh, definitely. But he didn't need to know that yet. "The runaways?" we asked gently, coldly, and waited for just a moment, watching his eyes to make sure he wouldn't scream, and then removed the gag. "Jesus, my ear!" "You have another, just as good," we said. "Tell us about the girls and the pictures." "Us? What do you mean us? Jesus, that hurts," he whimpered. Some people just don't get it. I put the plastic stuff back in his mouth and went to work. I almost got carried away. Easy to do under the circumstances. My heart was racing like mad, and I had to fight to keep my hand from shaking. But I went to work, exploring, looking for something that was always just beyond my fingertips. Exciting and terribly frustrating. The pressure was rising inside me, climbing up into my ears and screaming for release. But no release came. Just the growing pressure and the sense that something wonderful was just beyond my senses, waiting for me to find it and dive in. But I did not find it. And none of my old standards gave me any joy at all. What to do? In my confusion, I opened up a vein and a horrible puddle of blood formed on the plastic wrap alongside the janitor. I stopped for a moment. I stared, forgetting to breathe. The moon was visible over the water. For some reason, I could not explain that. It seemed so right, so necessary, that for a moment I just looked out across the water, watching it shimmer. So very perfect. I swayed and bumped against my makeshift table and came back to myself. But the moon, or was it the water? So close. I was so close to something I could almost smell, but what? A shiver ran through me, and that was right, too. So right, it set off a whole chain of shivers until my teeth chattered. But why? What did it mean? Something was there, something important, an overwhelming purity and clarity riding the moon and the water just beyond the tip of my fillet knife, and I couldn't catch it. I looked back at the janitor. He made me so angry, but the way he was lying there covered with improvised marks and unnecessary blood. But it was hard to stay angry with the beautiful Florida moon pounding at me, the tropical breeze blowing, and the wonderful night sounds of flexing duct tape and panic breathing. I almost had to laugh. Some people chose to die for some very unusual things, but this horrid little bug dying for copper wire. And the look on his face, so hurt and confused and desperate. It would have been funny if I hadn't felt so fucking frustrated. And he really did deserve a better effort from me. After all, it wasn't his fault. I was off my usual form. He wasn't even vile enough to be at the top of my to-do list. He was just a repulsive little slug who killed children for money and kicks, and only 4 or 5 of them as far as I knew. I almost felt sorry for him. He truly wasn't ready for the major leagues. Well. Back to work. I stepped back to Jaworski's side. He was not thrashing as much now, but he was still far too lively for my usual methods. Of course, I did not have all night for my highly professional toys tonight, and the going must have been a little rough for Jaworski, but like a real trooper, he had not complained. I felt a surge of affection and slowed down my slapdash approach, spending some quality time on his hands. He responded with real enthusiasm, and I drifted away lost in happy research. Eventually, it was his muffled screams and wild thrashing that called me back to myself. And I remembered I had not even made sure of his guilt. I waited for him to calm down and then remove the plastic from his mouth. "The runaways?" we asked. "Oh, Jesus! Oh, God! Oh, Jesus!" he said weakly. "I don't think so," we said. "I think we may have left them behind." "Please," he said. "Oh, please." "Tell me about the runaways," we said. "You took those girls." "Yes." "How many?" He just breathed for a moment. His eyes were closed, and I thought I might have lost him a little early. He finally opened his eyes and looked at me. Five, he said at last. 5 little beauties. I'm not sorry." "Of course you're not," we said. I placed a hand on his arm. It was beautiful. Such a beautiful moment. "And now I'm not sorry either." I stuffed the plastic back into his mouth and went back to work, but I had really only just started to recapture my rhythm when I heard the guard arrive downstairs.
Root toot toot roo, ri ti ti ti, rat ta ta ta. Subscribe.